English translation 656th contact. Sunday the 17th of July 2016, 20:58 hours.
Greetings, dear friend. You come quick.
I still had something to do, but came quickly anyway. But be greeted, dear friend, and also be welcome, even if you surprise me with your visit, because I did not expect you until next week.
I felt the need to bring you the extract from that conversation from my father and from what you asked me to do recently. It is a good thing that you are engaged in various parts of the conversations between my father and yourself, because these old extracts of conversations bring you advantages in terms of bringing back memories of many things that are valuable to you, but also aspects of many things that were taught to you at that time, through which you were able to cope with everything and bring about all that shaped your life and work. You conducted the conversation you asked for on Sunday, the 5th of May, 1946, in which many important things were discussed.
Thank you for your efforts, and it seems that I can refresh my memories through the old records of your father's faith. But before we get into the records, I want to ask you what you think of the military coup attempt in Turkey by which dictator Erdogan was to be overthrown. On the one hand, the whole thing seems extremely strange to me, because everything has been going on in an effectively bungling manner. On the other hand, I know how very sophisticated and well thought out various earlier coups and government overthrows have taken place in Turkey. It seems to me that everything was programmed and predetermined in such a way that it had to fail. Something is just not right about everything, and gives the impression that everything was staged as it happened in order to achieve something specific.
Your thoughts correspond to what was actually the case. We have been observing Erdogan and the Turkish system of government that determined him for years, and we were informed that he would not tolerate opposition and would not spare human lives in order to demonstrate and assert his power, as has been openly proven over all these years by the military, police, and secret service operations he has ordered against his own people and against the Kurds. Consequently, we are also oriented towards what lies behind what you call a bungling military coup attempt. This was in fact predetermined in a way that had taken place, prepared since the beginning of 2015 by close confidants of Erdogan, who designed the idea and procedure, etc. for it, but who were then elaborated by his close confidants and put into reality. The whole served and continues to serve the purpose of bringing Erdogan unrestricted benefit. So it was not a well thought out overthrow of government to drive Erdogan out of his office, but to strengthen him in it and make him through the Turkish people extensively all the state and concede autocracy. Erdogan, as we have already seen in one of our conversations, is a sectarian dictator who suggestively deceives the people through lies and deception and pulls them to his side in order to establish a theocracy in Turkey. And unfortunately, many of the people are so ignorant that they can neither recognize nor judge the criminal machinations of Erdogan and, following this, cheer him, act carelessly according to his demands, and by their stupid actions endanger the security, peace, and freedom of the whole people. In truth, Erdogan is an unscrupulous and inhuman ruler, whom I want to call an autocracy dictator with a new term, who strives for absolute autocracy, and who in his sectarian delusion is more dangerous and ruthless than an ordinary dictator. In principle, therefore, his autocracy is the form of a totalitarian exercise of power, from which he strives for an absolute right of his own without the empowerment of the Turkish people, to which he is entitled to all criminal means and does not intend to account for. As the ruler, he wants to see all the competences of an autocratic dictatorial system in his own central power. Following that, he does not envisage the participation of the people in his state power, nor a higher authority of any kind that could control and legitimize his exercise of power. Erdogan wants his autocratic dictatorial rule to be his own absolute authority and accountable to no one. As a sectarian believer, he claims a grace of God in order to exercise unrestricted, absolute authority over the land and the people. In this way, he imagines himself in his delusion as a ruler who has to bear the sole responsibility towards God, imagining himself in this regard to act according to God's mandate, sense and will, and to surrender and destroy all those who are against his power, delusion, and degenerated autocratic dictatorial sense of autocracy, following his closely conspired ones and the people to the reintroduction of the death penalty. Erdogan is unscrupulous and irresponsible, and for him a human life is worth nothing more than a withered blade of grass, as a saying goes. Erdogan, as the ruler, wants to be the sole owner of all competences concerning the country and the population and their autocratic dictatorial leadership, following which he also devised the coup attempt himself and had it implemented by his close confidants. The allies with him did this fraudulently and secretly, persuading many leading politicians, judges, public prosecutors, etc., as well as the military of the land and air forces and the navy, but also subordinate military forces, to build up a military-led attempt to overthrow the government, and they did so well aware that the whole thing had to be doomed to failure from the very beginning, because Erdogan had determined so. This is because the coup attempt should not lead to the overthrow of Erdogan, but to his strengthening as an unrestricted ruler over Turkey and its people. Since the year 2014, the aim has been to list all possible opponents and counterparties by the thousands, in order to arrest them in the case of the predetermined failed coup attempt, and to bring them to a criminal justice violating jurisdiction, and to punish them against every right. So it follows now that all of the right thousands of times against Erdogan and his plans, as well as his autocratic dictatorial government, and his striving for power-directed forces, academics, scientists, opponents, and dissenters, as well as hostile people, etc., by malicious, brutal, unjust, and possibly fatal purges of their offices and deprived of their freedom and unlawfully punished. But it will not be enough that after the suppression of the fictitious coup attempt, thousands of military, police, and Secret Service members, governors, prosecutors, and judges will be arrested in order to punish them drastically. But through the so-called cleansing, the freedom of the media will generally also be suspended, many media houses closed, many journalists arrested, as well as countless other arrests made by civil servants, teachers, students, and responsible persons, etc., of universities and many schools, who are threatened with severe punishment if they are suspected of being guilty of coup d'etat as a result of Erdogan's fear and power struggles. In total, there will be tens of thousands who will fall victim to the wave of arrests, which is intended on the one hand to fulfill Erdogan's absolute greed for power, but on the other to suppress his cowardly fear of the possible failure of his nefarious and unscrupulous autocratic dictatorial reign. It is therefore generally clear that Erdogan's power behavior corresponds to an illegitimate autocracy dictatorship, whereby he absolutistically recognizes only his self-created rights of injustice and deprives the Turkish people of any freedom and security, because he sees himself as an undemocratic autocratic dictatorial ruler who in principle is not bound by any legal norms. And if he really succeeds in his plan to gain totalitarian power, he will bring much disaster, bondage, insecurity, and many deaths and destruction about Turkey, its people, and also about the Kurds by the factual circumstances and possibilities of his exercise of power. And he will try to achieve this in a short time through dictatorial decrees, with the support of the majority of the misled people and his followers in bondage.
I can imagine that. But it is to be hoped that the Turkish population will wake up and recognize what is really at the helm with Erdogan and what he is up to with everything. But if he can finally win the majority of the people over to his side and realize his ideas and plans with regard to his megalomania, then things will look bad. But let us leave that and turn to the conversation that was between Svath and me, for nothing can be done by us to remove Erdogan from office and prevent what is to come. Do you even know anything about it? Maybe through a look at the future or probability calculations?
Yes, but
I see what you mean. Then there's the conversation between Svath and me.
then listen to what was said on the 5th of May, 1946, during the conversation between you and my father, which you must, as usual, when you call up and write down the whole thing, translate from Swiss German into written German.
Excerpt from Contact Conversation from Sunday, the 5th of May, 1946.
You turned 99 years old in February, have learned a lot during the last 2 years through my teachings, and are now very knowledgeable in many matters. What I have to explain to you today, however, corresponds to a further continuation of your decision and of all those explanations and facts which I already gave you on the 2nd of June, 1944, at our first major decision and explanation discussion, which was followed by further informative discussions until today. Last year, then, on the 3rd of February, 1945, I brought you close to my first initiation and introductory talk, and clearly initiated you into the task of your mission.
Svath, may I interrupt you?
Of course, if you have a question.
Yes, that's because I do not understand why you say that we had two first conversations, one on the 2nd of June, 1944, then one on the 3rd of February, 1945. The really first conversation was
Your question is justified, but it can be explained that the first conversation in June 1944 was, from my point of view, an informative, explanatory, and decision-making discussion, and is therefore to be understood in this way as the first conversation. The second, and even first conversation from the 3rd of February 1945, on the other hand, it was a fact-related introductory, initiatory, and clarification talk concerning your task and mission, as well as many circumstances, etc. My naming of these two conversations may seem confusing to you, but they really are to be considered, judged, and understood as two different first conversation.
Now what? Yeah, it is a little confusing, but I can understand it.
Like the last years, I have to make you familiar with many facts today, which you will understand very well, and also consciously cope with and process, but which will only be possible for you. Because through my intervention into your consciousness development in your reason and in your mind, you are already many times further developed than normally with an Earth boy at your age, and even with a fourfold old Earthman can be the case. Well, also with regard to the first, and all the other conversations held with you regarding the explanation of your task and mission, there is something more to say, namely that I will bring up the same facts several times and at different times, which is based on it, so that through this method of repetition you recall again and again the details of all the interests that are of importance to you and your task and mission from my explanations and from all that you have learned and continue to learn. This also includes knowledge that will only interest you in later decades, but I would like to point out to you already today that you will have to deal intensively with it from the next decade, and especially from the 1970s at the latest, when you begin to build up your work and mission. It will then be that you will have to inform yourself in detail and also learn something new, namely with regard to finance, to which I now want to introduce you to the following. The future of the terrestrial banking, corporate and corporate system, as well as of politics, governments and the economy will be very profitable in the coming decades. After which, however, a comprehensive mismanagement will appear in all camps and cause many things to collapse from the 1980s until well into the new millennium, especially in Europe and thus also in Switzerland, as well as in the USA and Canada. Banks, companies, and corporations will be in great difficulty and will have to make use of state aid for their continued existence, although for some their mismanagement will lead to bankruptcy. However, the populations of many of these countries, particularly throughout Europe, the United States, and Canada, will also incur financial debts on a private basis, which will make them unable to meet their financial obligations, as will the national budgets of many countries which are no longer able to cope with their debts. The whole thing leads to serious economic collapses and to the dissolution and bankruptcy of long-established banks. Companies and corporations managed over long decades of rights as well as to years of public finance problems and constant changes of government as a result of incapable rulers. And to come back to the private sphere, as I said before, large financial debts arise because a senseless and uncontrollable squandering of money for many unnecessary things in the populations will spread far and wide and even cause family needs and family destruction as well as serious criminal acts and deeds. The emerging and rapidly developing economic upswing will rapidly increase the wages of workers and also drive the general standard of living into higher forms, which will tempt people to incur ever greater financial expenditures and debts that they cannot afford in terms of wage income. For you, your family, the working and mission group and their individual members, as well as for a center that you will build with the help of your faithful gathered around you in a known place, on a not far elevated place near the birthplace of your mother, according to your ideas, you will then continue your efforts to familiarize yourself with a large financial budget. And in this regard, you will voluntarily take responsibility and administration for the community you form as an association, and whose members you will also advise and assist. But the future of the financial economy will be difficult, because from 1988 onwards the whole world will be even gloomier in terms of money, because then the foundation of a capital power will take place in the USA, which will intervene as a worldwide shadow bank and world shadow government in the entire world, finance and control many countries and their structures. In the United States itself, this capital power will develop into an internal shadow government which secretly, for the people of the United States, will govern the United States of America at its own will, as will another U.S. shadow government which has existed for a long time and will continue to exist for a long time to come. The new capital power that will be established in 1988, as I have already explained, will build a worldwide capital network in a short time, which will not only dominate the financial world of banks, but also politics, various states, and the economies of many countries, according to the power structures of this world shadow government. With regard to these things, you have to learn a lot. So also use many facts which I have already told you, and will continue to tell you, to write fact-pointing and warning letters concerning the dangerous and unpeaceful coming world events. But you shall also name the threatening, disastrous machinations of the overpopulation which destroy nature, the waters, and the climate, which degenerate and which infiltrate the natural which will lead to very serious natural catastrophes similar to those of the primal world, if all the future threatening and degenerating machinations of the overpopulation which continues to develop very rapidly are not stopped. The beginning has already been set for this with the overpopulation of around 2.8 billion people, which has been widely translated and which, since the last, and especially in this century, as a result of the acts of world warfare in connection with the mechanization and misuse of nuclear energy and the criminal application of gases and poisons, etc., will already have serious consequences for the climate and the environment. So the bad effects regarding the climate destruction caused by the guilt of earthly mankind will already show up in the next month of December, and that these coming climate changes, which will continue into the distant future, will be real consequences of overpopulation, will be denied by scientists and all those responsible well into the third millennium. It will be true that in time it will be recognized that all sorts of irresponsible machinations of mankind will cause climate change, but there will be no question that the natural, planetary and climate-destroying machinations will come about to their extent only by the far above Earth-compatible measure of the unstoppably growing overpopulation. The main causes of climate change, which will actually be climate degradation, will be found in a number of manipulative forms triggered by the masses of humanity, which will involve the entire terrestrial ecosystem, climate, atmospheres, and nature, and the entire planet, destroying it to its very foundations. Everything will be triggered by irresponsible exploitation of Earth resources, poisoning and pollution of the atmosphere, nature, fauna and flora, oceans and inland waters by various toxic gases, emissions from explosion engines, and heating systems powered by fossil fuels. Also artificial fertilizers and all kinds of herbicides, pesticides and many other substances will have a destructive effect on the whole nature, fauna and flora, and also cause many serious illnesses in humans. And poison gases also dangerously reduce the ozone layer, which will lead to skin cancer and other illnesses in humans, and also cause many changes in fauna and flora. Whole seas and inland waters will also be polluted and contaminated with toxins and all kinds of refuse. Particularly many-sided plastics in all waters of the world will bring for innumerable water life forms a miserable dying and death, which will affect also corridors, meadows and forests and many land-living beings. The plastic, I will explain, was invented as early as 1531 in what was then Germany from the processing of cheese as an artificial horn, or casein. But new forms and products will also be invented in the coming decades, which in the course of a few decades will lead to a terrible environmental catastrophe, because people will carelessly and irresponsibly dispose of vast quantities of plastics in the wild, and all the causes and effects will lead to environmental catastrophes, to which the whole earthly mankind will only become very difficult or no longer master at all, because in relation to the growing overpopulation, everything in terms of environmental pollution, environmental, planetary, natural climate, atmospheric fauna, and flora destruction will become ever more extensive, dangerous, life-destroying, and destructive. And the beginning for it was laid by the already existing overpopulation and its degenerated machinations, to which in the worst way the worldwide coming climate change with its worldwide destructive consequences will belong. First and foremost, the United States will provide the source and bear the full blame for this through its criminally irresponsible first nuclear test and the 2 atomic bomb drops on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These 3 irresponsible crimes committed against the planet, nature, climate, fauna and flora, and humanity will now lead to the first drastic and serious consequences of a rapidly and unstoppably developing and all-encompassing, very adverse climate change from the coming month of December. So, in 8 months, a climate change will inevitably become more and more widespread, from which in the next 50 years ever worse natural disasters will develop, which will cause an undreamt-of amount of human misery and destruction all over the world. But what will now result from the American nuclear crime extensively at the planet, the entire earthly mankind, the nature, fauna and flora, the atmosphere, and at the climate, that take now everything its destructive course. Consequently, the first heavy climate changes impending, which announce themselves starting from next month, December. So it happens that in the coming month of December, all of Central Europe will be hit by an unusual cold wave to minus 30 degrees, which will also affect England and lead to the frostbite of a large number of people, and will not end until the middle of March next year, that is to say, 1947. But the coming extreme weather conditions will be even more far-reaching and will last until 1948 and will also bring much need, suffering and misery for people in other countries, also in the future far into the 3rd millennium. And this will also be the case with the forthcoming cold winter, which will be called the Winter of Hunger from next year, and which will also be connected with the food crisis that began at the beginning of this year, which will demand the death of several 100,000 people in Europe, will spread to the Soviet Union, and will cause the deaths of more than 2.4 million people there, as in other countries. But when next year the cold wave comes to an end in the month of March, a big heat wave and a very hot summer will begin, which will last throughout Europe until the end of September, will not bring a drop of rain, and will be recorded in the annals as Steppe Summer 1947. Depending on the place and region, temperatures will range from 39.5 degrees Celsius in the shade to 47 degrees Celsius in the sun, with certain fruit trees flowering twice and bearing small fruit. Meadows, vegetable gardens and meadows will dry out, as well as smaller lakes and streams, as well as large lakes and rivers will fall into a very low water level. And because rainwater will be lacking everywhere, a lot of livestock will have to be slaughtered all over Europe, because due to the lack of rain, there will be no more food for the animals. Water is then also lacking in nature, where animals die of thirst, and so 2 years after the last World War, there will be great hardship all around, with people suffering hunger in certain areas, which will be exacerbated by the extreme heat. And because in many places there will be no rain at all, and also no water, bad harvest prospects will arise, because the days will be hot and sunny and no plants will grow. And because no rain will fall, the farmers also cannot sow the next seed. Consequently, there will be no harvests, and then there will be shortage of certain food. However, all the cold and heat waves will be trivialized and attributed to natural weather changes by meteorologists, climate researchers, certain other scientists, and the general public. It will be claimed for a long time, and until the third millennium, that these are natural changing weather processes that would occur from time to time. So during the next 5 decades, neither scientists nor mankind itself will worry about the real causes. They will all contradict the fact that, as a result of the degenerating and irresponsible machinations, everything will be caused by the devastating excesses of overpopulation in nature, the climate, and the atmosphere, and will expand more and more and begin to spread hopelessly. The coming decades will also bring many new uprisings, civil wars, and revolutions around the world well into the third millennium, as well as malicious and unscrupulous dictators will continue to carry out their murderous work over their peoples, for which the USA will often do everything to overthrow foreign governments for its own benefit, as it has done in the past. In the foreseeable future, a worldwide and religiously caused sectarian and, on the other hand, also inhumanly criminal terrorism will develop, for which the USA, with its politics, and from the year 1756 on, practically all USA state authorities who have been since then lived in the delusion of having to seize world domination with secret service, military and warlike interventions in the interests of foreign states, and to rob the defeated states of their earth resources and treasures. And with very few exceptions, which you can count on half a hand, the coming USA rulers will do the same, because the American mania for world domination will continue to exist uninhibitedly, and also in the future will bring endless suffering and misery, torture, death, and destruction over the world. But also all those elements act in the same way and draw along who are present in power and as followers, and thus also of the same sense, just as all those of the same kind will act in the same way who will be in the future. And these will be the authorities themselves, as well as their advisors and followers, commanders of the secret services and the military, and so on. However, criminal organizations of various kinds will also emerge worldwide, as will extremely radical racist and religious sectarian organizations, from which will also emerge various religious and delusional death cults, which will demand hundreds of thousands of murdered people, especially in the USA, South America, Switzerland, Japan, and Canada, as well as in Arabia, Africa, Asia, France, and some other countries in Europe, as a result of religious insanity and power madness. You will have to consider all these facts just as thoroughly as all that I have explained, said, and taught you in the last years, because from the next decade, you will have to write corresponding letters which you will have to send to all governments and to many public media to point out to them what will happen if not finally practiced extensively by earthly mankind. If this does not happen, if your words are not heeded and do not bear fruit, then Earth and its humanity will have a very evil and evil future. And so that you can fulfill your task in this regard as well, I will continue to teach you the art of good writing, as I have done since your 4th year without your conscious knowledge, through impulse-guided tours, whereby you learn to write without the knowledge of your parents before you were integrated into the school. And as I have done this since 1944 with your consent and knowledge, I will also do it in the future. But despite the extensive knowledge you have acquired so far, you still have a lot to learn until 1953, and your interests must be focused on many things that you need to know and understand. So you must be fundamentally and unusually interested in your age in many things which will happen in the future in your life, as well as in the world in all sorts of respects, much more than what I've taught and explained to you so far, with all the different explanations and predictions until today, and still have to tell you in the coming years. Actually, you must be interested in everything, especially because you have to learn to deal with everything through your thoughts and feelings, and to prepare yourself to strengthen your psyche and to cope with everything in every respect. That is why you should not rise above other people, but always remain humble, because humility is the mother of all virtues, which you must always respect. Even if you know many of the coming events of the future, and you are more knowledgeable in these matters than people in general, just as you will have knowledge which is not attainable by other people in regard to the doctrine of mission and everything connected with it, you should always remain modest to anticipate forthcoming events, as I have already made clear to you in other explanations, means in any case, and whatever it may be, a very heavy burden on your consciousness and psyche, especially when it is a matter of events, which on the one hand are related to you personally, or on the other hand are directed against your personal attitude, honor, morals, behavior, and dignity regarding the value of life, the well-being of people, all forms of life and nature. And since, according to your attitude, your character, your morals, and the ways of your thoughts, feelings, and forms of your behavior directed according to the laws and recommendations of creation, all that is bizarre resists you in accordance with your attitude and your laws and recommendations of creation, it is necessary that I continue to teach you how you can maintain the healthy state of your consciousness and your psyche through your thoughts and as before. However, you must use your own mind and your own reason in order to follow the path given to you personally in this regard and to achieve your goal. This is of great necessity, for without this inevitable learning to nurture your thoughts and feelings in a correct and positive way so that your psyche remains balanced and healthy, you would not be able to cope with many explanations and predictions, for they would burden you so badly that you would break them when they arrive in the future time and truly surrender. Through learning, however, you will become powerful in your thoughts and feelings. Learn to control them and also be able to keep your state of consciousness and psychology under control. Even if you experience great suffering, pain, and deep sadness, which you often encounter in your life and therefore will not be spared. So it is of pretending necessity that you are concerned with it now and also in the future, and prepare yourself for the future, especially to shape and control your thoughts and feelings in such a way that you never get into trouble with your consciousness and psyche. So I will also strictly instruct and teach you according to our psychology and psychology superior to earthly knowledge, which will be of great importance to you as well as to yourself, in order to always behave correctly towards yourself in a psychological manner. But it will also be necessary for you to be able to correctly recognize and judge the psychic impulses of people, whereby, on the one hand, you can protect yourself from harm, but on the other hand, you can also help them to recover from life and behavior if necessary. So through this teaching and instruction, you will gain much more knowledge than any earthly study of psychology would be able to offer you. But now, with regard to everything that is related to yourself and will happen in the world, what I have already told you in other conversations and what I will continue to do, you must bring your thoughts, feelings, consciousness, and psyche under control in such a way that you can cope with and get through very bad things without harm. Because your life itself, as well as your task and mission, will demand that of you. And it will often be the case and necessary in your life that you have a strong consciousness, strong controlled thoughts and feelings, and a strong, healthy psyche. There will be much to come, because far from your homeland, you will live an adventurous and not harmless life before you return home after many years. Settle down and begin your work and mission, which, however, will not be easy, but with much work and malicious attacks against your life, and with adversities against you and your mission efforts. On the outside, however, and I must say this again and demand it of you, you must keep silence towards all people about everything, because it would be dangerous on the one hand to speak openly about what I have taught you and will continue to teach you as explanations and predictions, because a foreknowledge of the facts would cause fear and horror in people. So you can talk openly about anything that does not concern such facts of silence, needing to point out the things I've already had to keep quiet about, and also have to do so about further information that I will be giving you over the next 7 years. Even with power-obsessed rulers of every significance, racist organizations, religionists of all shades, priests, pastors and theologians, sects and scientists, criminals and adversaries of every kind, actions and deeds could be conjured up by which you and your task and mission would be endangered by serious harm. Everything could also lead to worldwide human-induced catastrophes. However, it cannot be avoided that you will be insulted by religionists, especially by blind, fanatical, and self-opinionated priests and theologians, as well as know-it-alls, enviers, sect prisoners, and all sorts of other adversaries of lies, deception, charlatanry, and dizziness, as well as by attacks on your life, which will try to silence you in the truest sense of the word in order to damage your mission, to present it as untrustworthy, and to destroy it. But it will also be inevitable that state security services will monitor you and malicious people will denounce you to the authorities, secret services, and police by lies and deception, which you should not pay attention to, but simply carry out your important work and mission unperturbed, which will also bring success.
What you say and what you have also explained and taught me over the last few years, I can and could understand well. I have always thought a lot about everything, and many things inspired me in the way I thought about what would ultimately result from everything. This is the case, for example, with the rapidly growing overpopulation, which you have already mentioned several times and said that worldwide terror will also result from this, and that it will only come about as a result of the many different effects of overpopulation. You also told me that I should write down your explanations from 1951 onwards and spread them as warnings. But I think that I must know much more for this, such as what the origin of everything you say will be, that it will come in the coming times. Also, because of the increasing overpopulation and everything that will result from it, I should know more.
You are right, and really think about everything, which is what you also ask about the origin of the coming events. The overpopulation, yes, which evils will result from it. In the future, I will still have to explain much about it to you. But now I will first explain what the beginning or origin of very many in the next 5.5 decades will be in terms of hopeless things, factors, and terrible events, which will also take place far into the third millennium through the guilt of the political, military, economic, scientific, world domination, addicted, and criminal machinations of the USA. Already next year, a lot of inhuman evil will arise worldwide, and a lot of misfortune will take its beginning. And through the criminal actions of the USA, terrorism also arises in many places, as well as the destruction of the livelihoods of millions of people by food companies, and as a result of the depletion of earth resources, the destruction of nature, and catastrophes. For the most part, all malicious incidents, such as wars, bloody uprisings, civil wars, insidious intelligence operations, revolutions, overthrow of governments, mass murders, and destruction, are conjured up by the United States, and America will continue to bring much evil, misery, as well as 1,000 times death over earth and all mankind, because from there also a religious, delusional sectarianism will spread over the world and claim thousands of deaths. From now until far into the future of the third millennium, new power-controlled political, military, and Secret Service machinations of America will lead to wars, revolutions, and terrorism around the world, because it will begin again with a nuclear program and with nuclear bomb tests, and will also animate other states to the same actions, which will then be continued in coming times until far into the third millennium, which will force many people to flee and radioactively radiate much. From the new nuclear program of the USA, a worldwide nuclear espionage will develop, evenly, which results from this worldwide in the course of time. As a result of espionage, the Soviet Union and China will also come into possession of documents for atomic bomb technology and carry out many tests in equal measure, contaminate many areas and waters atomically, and come into possession of the bombs. The espionage to get in possession of plans and documents, etc., concerning the atomic bomb technology, however, will also be carried out by different other countries. Consequently, in the coming time, and still sometime before the beginning of the third millennium, in several other states than the USA, China and the Soviet Union, which will be called Russia again from the 1990s onwards, nuclear bombs will be produced and large stocks of nuclear weapons will be established. The technical development of nuclear technology, known as nuclear weapons technology, has been going on since 1940 and is based on something that I will teach and inform you about later. This will increase the danger of a military armament of the world power states, especially the USA and the Soviet Union, but also China, England, France, and Canada, as well as various other countries, even if they will not be as powerful as the USA and the Soviet Union. And since the Western states, especially Europe and the USA, have always been traditionally hostile to the Russian Tsarist Empire, this will lead to an arms race between all states with ever more modern weapons. In particular, atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, plutonium implosion bombs, etc. will be created and tested, which generate an enormous amount of energy for an explosion from nuclear reactions by nuclear fission or fusion, in which respect nuclear research will produce a wide variety of different variants. And in the future, many thousands of such bombs and other nuclear weapons will be created and stored as a deterrent and threat by the world power states, especially by the USA and the Soviet Union. And in this way, a dangerous state will be created, which until close to the third millennium will be under the evil sign of an imminent and worldwide and world-destroying nuclear war. And it will be many times in the 1970s and 1980s that misunderstandings threaten nuclear wars to break out. Once it will be through a false report on a Soviet spy satellite that will record sun reflections on clouds, which will then be falsely assessed as the launch of a US nuclear missile against the USSR and become the threat of a Soviet nuclear strike. As a result of the nuclear arms race, more and more dangerous situations of misunderstanding will arise before and after the nuclear arms race. Because military false alarms have existed since the beginning of the nuclear age, which began in 1940. And such false alarms will always occur again, because in the defense concepts of the American and Soviet military blocs and the rocket early warning systems, there was an extensive faultiness which will constantly conjure up nuclear war threats. Particularly great dangers will unfold in the coming decades when the fear, stupidity, and unreasonableness of those in power and their advisers will lead to increased tensions between the USA and the USSR. Although, as has been customary since time immemorial, the dangerous aggressions will emanate from the United States of America, while the Soviet Union will behave cautiously but suspiciously. This will be especially true when in the late 1970s and 1980s a lax détente policy collapses, leading to a new mutual mistrust between the two world powers, which will culminate in a high and dangerous climax and lead to a further and mad right-stocking of the nuclear arsenal that could destroy the entire surface of Earth and all life. And it will be that, in many cases, the world will barely escape a nuclear war, although it will not change the fact that in 1949 the so-called North Atlantic Pact will be founded, which will come into being on the basis of the United Nations in order to create a global system of collective security. The North Atlantic Treaty then owes its origins to the signing in San Francisco on the 26th of June last year of the Charter of the United Nations, which is regarded as the constitution of the international community and was intended to create a Western European alliance and thus a global system for collective security. Nevertheless, with the end of last year's World War, no phase of global peace was created, but a state of Cold War, which will become a determining factor for future political, military, and economic development, and which will, in various ways, degenerate into a nuclear war. As a result of the inability of the USA and the Soviet Union, which have been hostile to each other for a long time as major powers, and as the only of all the states involved in the last World War, they pursue different military and political interests. As a rule, American demands were and are made to the USSR, which are advantageous only for the USA. Thus, both countries, as former allies in the World War triggered by Hitler and the Nazi Empire, will continue to create conflicts between themselves, which will lead to differences between the USA and the Soviet Union, whereby the enmity and these differences have become blatantly and openly apparent since the end of the World War. And this enmity will not remain with the USA and the USR, but will also reach far into the world, into many other countries, and cause uprisings, wars, revolutions, discord, and terrorism. It will also be the case that the military and state policy and the secret services of the USA will interfere in foreign dealings and problems, allow themselves to be provoked and carried out by sneaky government upheavals, and bear a great deal of blame for everything. And since the political power of the USA still tends towards absolute world domination, the American Secret Services and military power will also carry out actions, wars, as well as veiled terrorist acts and government infiltrations directly in foreign countries and keep them under occupation-like control. All this will have adverse political, military, and economic, as well as many other bad consequences in all countries where the military, politics, and economy of the USA nest, and all this will lead to insurrections, anarchism, riots, civil wars, xenophobia, and racial hatred, as well as to anarchistic, deadly, and criminal political groups, which will indulge their delusions by murdering them. But also, worldwide terror organizations will emerge, whose fanatical founders will be trained by military, etc. of the USA to fighters, who then gather like-minded people around themselves and carry out bloody religious political fights into the whole world and mercilessly torture and murder countless other believers and innocent people bestially. However, as I have already explained in earlier statements, in the coming times and well into the third millennium, Secret Service, military, criminal, warlike, and even terrorist, subversive, political and economic machinations emerging in foreign countries by the USA will cause many state systems to collapse and lead to civil wars and terrorist wars, resulting in large streams of refugees and flight-like migrations of peoples. So a very unpleasant and far-reaching terrorism will develop, as well as an unstoppable refugee system until the distant future. Over time, this will result in extensive streams of refugees that will spread all over the world, and in 70 years will comprise around 70 million refugees, whereby in the second decade of the new or third millennium, an irresponsibly naive and sick woman in power in Germany will do all she can to ensure that millions of refugees will flow into Europe from politically and economically underdeveloped and insecure countries burdened by war and terrorism. Many of them will be real refugees and refugees at risk of their lives only by name, because a large number of others will flee their homeland at that distant time only for economic, criminal, and terrorist reasons, in order to profit in the countries of refugee and to act criminal. But they will also be degenerates in religious sectarian aberrations who pretend to be refugees in need in order to arrive as terrorists in countries of refugee in which other religions and sects predominate, in order to spread death, disaster, and destruction there, above all among the innocent people of other faiths who are uninvolved in war and terror. However, the majority of those in power and those responsible for refugee immigration will be largely incapable of dealing logically and reasonably with the emergence of the problems that arise, for they will make wrong and inadequate decisions and will take and adopt measures that will be useless and will allow the evils to continue. This will mean that the problems and difficulties of handling the masses of refugees and what is to be done about them will be all the more exacerbated and make the necessary solutions more difficult. The result is that immigrant criminal, terrorist, and criminal elements are paved the way for unlawful acts, and thus also for murder, mass murder, and destruction. Thus, more and more problems and degenerations will also arise, which will result from crime and crimes as a result of the refugee disaster and the manifold political, paramilitary, racist, as well as religious and sectarian terrorism still towards the end of the second millennium and at the beginning of the third millennium and far beyond in Europe and also worldwide. And it will be that the refugee problems can then only be solved by rigorous measures, whereby the necessary measures and steps are not taken by the governments and other responsible persons, and consequently neither the right decisions, nor precautions, nor the right actions are taken. And this will be so because they neither see reality nor are able to judge everything correctly. Consequently, the problems will not be solved, but deepen and increase. All those responsible do not see what will result from everything, because they will not be able to do so rationally and intellectually. Because some of those in power and others will think and act their responsibility only for themselves and will be indifferent to everything else, and thus also to the welfare and woe of people. It will therefore also be the case, especially in Europe, that all security organizations in the countries affected by the refugee system will be extremely naive, negligent and naive, and will not be able to identify the real situation for a long time. So they will miss the realization that with the streams of refugees, a very large number of criminal elements, as well as politically and religiously radicalized and sect-controlled terrorists charged with murder and destruction, will be smuggled into Europe and into all other countries of refuge, where in the course of time they will spread death, mischief, destruction, and destruction in individual or group perpetration. On the other hand, the other part will be so alien to life and reality, naive as well as mimosa-like, weak, effeminate, fragile, squeamish, and in thoughts, feelings, and with regard to humanity, so stupid and sickly that they trivialize everything, and all the more add to it that all evils continue to rise, and all problems increase all the more. And if the politicians and other responsible persons who are often controlled by the economy are asked about complex and important questions, then they will usually only give short answers because they are not able to think deeply, because their intellectual performance does not usually correspond to high quality and hardly requires high intelligence. In this regard, I have already explained to you several times in the last 2 years, but I would also like to point out that the rapidly increasing overpopulation will also lead to activities that will be politically, religiously, and sectarian, as well as terrorist in nature, and will cause malicious, murderous, and destructive consequences worldwide. Due to the ever-increasing overpopulation, more and more religious and sectarian believers, as well as murderous, degenerate people, will very quickly appear who fall into a completely degenerate, blind, fanatical, as well as blood and death-demanding religious faith and sectarian mania. And in this respect, especially in Asia, the Near East, as well as in Arabia and Africa, but also in other regions, large religion-related murderous and organized sects will form, spread death worldwide, and spread fear and terror. And that will be inevitable and will happen as the looking into the future clearly shows, and the beginning signs for it already arise today. The fanatical religious and sectarian faith represents a dangerous return of religions and sects in the coming decades and in the third millennium, triggering deadly religious confrontations, torture, violence, murder, wars, terrorism, oppression, rape, and destruction. The truth in this respect shows that the role of religions and sects is ambivalent and thus ambiguous and ambivalent, causing serious conflicts, with fanatical faith factors playing a major role in many malignant degenerations and effects. Among the believers of the various main religions and their almost innumerable sects, violence and hatred have reigned many times since time immemorial. Although all religions and their sects preach love and peace, which, however, corresponds nothing other than to a phrase of veiling in such a way that every religion and sect can captivate and exploit all believers in the world by their dogmas and their faith. In addition, it is to be consoled from the faithful that the religions and sects are truly hostile to one another, and that each one wants to alienate the faithful from the other faiths. Exactly this will happen in the coming new times before the turn of the millennium by planning and carrying out cross-denominational devotions, meetings of believers, prayer and discussion circles, church festivals, and church services, etc., but also bloody and deadly religious and sectarian machinations will increase, as will be the case in the coming month of August in the human-rich India, when in the city of Calcutta, as a result of government disputes between Islam and Hindu-believing, bloody clashes are provoked, which will claim more than 2,300 lives. And this will continue well into the third millennium, for the believers of one religion and their sects will always be hostile to the other religions and sects. Christians and Jews against Muslims and vice versa, Buddhists against Hinduists and vice versa, and all other believers in religion and sects against the other believers in religion and sects. Thus, the future in this respect will be, and also in the 21st century in many places of the world, torture and hundreds of thousands of times violence, murder, death, discord, rape, and destruction will bring. And this will likewise come about through hatred by large sections of the population in those countries in which streams of refugees migrate, and the refugees are of a different faith from the natives. The consequences will be xenophobia, religious hatred, sectarian and religious hatred, and racial hatred, which will spread throughout entire countries and cause fires, violence, murder, and manslaughter, inhumane acts and deeds, and great destruction. And in many countries, especially in Europe and the USA, xenophobic and racial hate groups and even large xenophobic and racial hate organizations will be formed, and their hate behavior will spread among the respective national populations, just as everything will be carried out into other states and into other populations, where further similar groups and organizations will be formed, which will then merge cross-border with others. From the xenophobia and racial hatred, a religious hatred will develop very fast, a hatred against people of other faiths, but also against people who think differently, who do not associate themselves with xenophobia and racial and religious hatred, and will distance themselves from it. So it will come that the hate-possessed and the dissidents and those who distance themselves from the hate who also form groups and organizations and resist any radical machinations regarding hostility, compassionlessness, ruthlessness, inhumanity, and irreconcilability, etc., towards dissidents and disbelievers, as well as refugees, will be more and more hostile towards each other and will fight each other up to bloody conflicts. Finally, it will be inevitable that the governments and the security organs of the countries will also be involved in these machinations, whereby civil war-like conditions or even real civil uprisings can arise out of everything. Many who indulge in the delusion of xenophobia, race, and religion will fall into an uncontrollable illusion of power and, through anarchism, torture, violence, and murder, into their xenophobia and racism, into an obsession with being the absolute master of the life and death of their fellow human beings. Following this, the possessed will gather around them large crowds of like-minded followers who will resort to weapons and all kinds of other lethal means to carry out assassinations and acts of terrorism worldwide and to massacre, murder, and destroy masses of people. The great mass of the overpopulation will lead to inevitable unemployment and ever greater poverty, which will leave countless people unemployed and inactive in their days and times, without a regulated future and without seeing a future, and tired of their hopeless condition. This will undoubtedly mean that many mostly young and younger people, in their hopelessness, will listen to criminal political seducers and sectarian preachers of hatred and terrorists, as well as other criminal propagandists, and will fall for them. Everything will happen in places of worship, in families, and by public bodies of various kinds, and also with new, modern techniques whereby individual people or whole groups will be indoctrinated by advertisers whose suggestive hiring and hate speeches for violence, war, and terror will bear fruit and lead to murderous assassinations, suicide attacks, and other bestial murders, as well as to immense destruction. So many women and men will go to war and terror and spread unspeakably much suffering, misery, pain, calamity, death, ruin, and destruction. And the more the overpopulation becomes, the more young and younger people in particular will see no chance for their future and will obey the sectarianism, assassinations, torture, war, murder, suicide, death, ruin, rape, and destruction of the screaming, power-obsessed, sect fanatics and terrorist preachers, and follow their inflammatory speeches and advertisements of lies. In this way, in the future, everything that is related to this will spread ever further and more maliciously around itself and expand into murderous terrorist organizations, which on the one hand will be strongly politically power-determined, but on the other hand will be particularly sectarian in their underlying interests. And in a sectarian way, several particularly large terrorist organizations will be formed, whose murderous and destructive consequences, especially in various Islamic countries, as well as in the USA, Asia, and Europe, will claim many thousands of lives. These murderous sectarian organizations, as a result of misinterpretation and misunderstanding of their religion, will, without mercy, grace, humanity, and forbearance, spread death and destruction in many countries throughout the world, and will seize whole or large parts of countries and terrorize them. But also many power-obsessed dictators, rulers and military of many countries will cause death and destruction, whereby in the future multiple changes of the forms of government will take place, which will accompany by bloody and murderous revolts, revolutions, and overthrow of governments. With acts of war, the USA will stand in front of all states, which, as since time immemorial, interfere politically, militarily, and secretly around the world in criminal form in foreign country interests and strive for world control and world domination. But also, allegedly, popular authorities and courts will deal with blood, torture, and death by judging people and handing them over to the death penalty, as will also be the case tomorrow, Monday, in Hamburg, Germany, where 11 people will be sentenced to death for making themselves guilty as concentration camp guards. And these death sentences will be followed by many others of the same kind in Germany by Allied military courts, not only as a result of war crimes and murder, but also for many other reasons of crime. In many other countries around the world, too, people, supported and condemned by lawfulness, are handed over to death because there is no humanity and no justice, but only dictatorial, bloodthirsty legislation which restricts or even completely lacks people's freedom and peace. And what the USA does in this respect, among many other things, does not reach the public, nor does the fact that since the end of the World War II last year, they also benefit from Nazi criminals and Nazi war criminals who were active in the Nazi Empire as scientists of different disciplines. Many of these criminals are transported to the USA by the American military as specialists for new weapon technologies of all kinds, and especially for the development of rockets, and are used there in the development of all kinds of secret weapon and rocket as well as aircraft systems. So these war criminal elements, of which already now more than 1,500 are experts and scientists with Nazi background, followed by others, all of whose inventions and developments must help the USA to its greatest world power, were not and will not be held accountable, but placed in special positions, endowed with special rights, but also granted state protection. Also, irresponsible crimes against all earthly humanity, the planet, the atmosphere, the climate, the land and the waters, as well as the nature and the fauna and flora, will appear again by power-obsessed and irresponsible rulers, military and scientists, etc. The United States of America will be at the forefront in this respect, primarily with regard to the development and use of nuclear weapons. Already researchers and scientists of the Nazi Empire tried to develop such weapon systems since 1938 and during the World War ended last year. However, fortunately, no usable nuclear weapon came thereby. Otherwise, Earth and mankind would have been plunged into an atomic disaster. Nevertheless, through the guilt of the USA and those countries that will emulate America, a catastrophe will spread worldwide. But a special explanation is necessary, which I will now name to you, whereby a Nazi war criminal named Kammler and his actions are to be mentioned of special importance. Kammler is an unscrupulous and very precise, logical and extremely calculating thinker, trained architect and engineer, and it was already clear to him at the beginning of the war begun in 1939 that it could not be won, and that a victory against the world powers as a whole was hopeless, because Hitler and his devotees had far underestimated the world powers USA and Soviet Union and those who allied themselves with them with regard to the entire weapons and armed forces potential. From the very beginning, Kammler saw through everything and also knew that he could use his great chance to live out his power mania by a ruthless cooperation with the Nazi regime, whereby he also already had the thought of turning into an enemy with important research material, etc., if the war situation would become dangerous for him. Consequently, he fitted into everything, calculatingly, but only for the sake of his exercise of power and to work his way up to become a powerful Nazi greatness and thus one of the most powerful men of the Nazi regime. So from the very beginning he was a traitor to Hitler and the Third Reich, because in his sense he did not work for them but only for himself and his power behavior. Kammler was severely disturbed in his personality, but he knew how to routinely overact and conceal this from other people through his acting skills. Thus, it was possible for him to quickly rise to the position of Obergruppenführer and General of the Waffen-SS of the Nazi dictatorship, and as a power-obsessed and cold-blooded mass murderer, unscrupulous Jew-hater and racist without equal, as well as a hate possessed against humans in general, to an important Nazi greatness. He was also responsible for the jet aircraft program, as well as for the very numerous underground armament factories, the production of the wing bombs V-1 and the ballistic missiles V-2. But when the end of the war came, for his personal safety's sake, he pushed away all his power exercised, seized secret and important research records and plans with the help of two confidants working on the nuclear weapons research program. These referred to a nuclear fission project and uranium project which, after the discovery of nuclear fission in Germany in 1938, was operated until the end of the World War, as Hitler had ordered. He personally gave the order to develop the nuclear fission technically usable into a widely devastating and destructive nuclear weapon. The extremely secret research in this field was therefore advanced very far and was about 15 years ahead of the similar research and development in the USA, so that the scientists were also given some successes which, however, did not bring any success until the end of the war, in the respect that they could have produced a functioning atomic bomb or other nuclear weapon. The Nazi dictatorship was thus denied actual nuclear weapons tests, which is why only 2 small explosion tests could be carried out, which, however, could only be evaluated with minimal success and were therefore of no significance. Nor was it possible to produce a nuclear chain reaction in a reactor because, despite extensive construction efforts, it was not possible to realize corresponding reactors. Nevertheless, the research was very advanced, whose valuable records and plans Kammler brought to himself with the help of his 2 confidants, along with nearly 68 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium. With all the necessary documents and the uranium, he succeeded in surrendering himself to the U.S. intelligence services in the hope of being welcomed, protected, and not brought before a war tribunal. In fact, contrary to his high level of intelligence and cunning, he was naive in this regard and thought that, as the bearer of the secret research papers, results, plans, and uranium, he was valued as a valuable defector, brought to the United States and protected by the Americans. But they knew that he was one of the worst Nazi war criminals accused of mass murder. As a result, he was arrested when he surrendered to the intelligence services, took away all his stolen secret records and plans and uranium, and imprisoned in a prison in the USA. The Americans knew about the nuclear fission research of the Nazi Empire and wanted, even before the Soviet Union, to get hold of the knowledge gained in this respect just as they wanted to secure for themselves the overall knowledge of German armament knowledge and the development lead in jet aircraft and rocket technology, the advanced technologies of which they were very shocked at. So they hunted for plans, records, scientists and researchers and parts of whole products to secure Nazi know-how before everything could fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. They also needed Kammler, who was extremely welcome to them with his knowledge and his records and plans, as well as the uranium, but not in his sense, because after his arrest in May last year, he was taken to the USA as a prisoner, and since then has been held in a high-security wing of a prison where he has been interrogated again and again for hours. But in the end, this is too much for him, and he ends his life in the course of the next year by suicide, as I have seen in a forecast. However, it is absolutely certain that the USA has made great use of the research records, results, findings, and plans received from Kammler and the weapons-grade uranium for their own research and plans, etc. That is absolutely and flawlessly certain. Only the more advanced knowledge of Nazi nuclear fission research gained by the collectors on the 16th of July last year at the White Sands missile range near the city of Alamogordo, New Mexico, could be used to carry out the first atomic bomb test at Trinity carried out by the USA, and then build the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these irresponsible and criminal monstrosities of the whole of humanity, the planet, the atmosphere, nature, fauna and flora of all land and all waters, and of the climate, will continue this year because the criminal nuclear tests will continue. So it will not stop with the atomic bombing of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th of August, and their destruction last year, which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and countless wounded and atomically contaminated people. And all elements that are criminally involved and advocating irresponsible and dehumanized in their convictions believe and continue to believe in their delusion to be in the right and to have acted and continue to act correctly in their criminal and inhuman way. So next month in July, the USA will carry out 2 new nuclear weapons tests on the Bikini Atoll. Already by the first atomic bomb test, and the bomb drops a crime against the whole mankind was committed, and with the new tests, a worldwide new crime will take place against the whole earthly mankind, which will have a very vicious effect also on the whole nature, the climate, and the whole plant world, and on all living beings on land and water, and will create innumerable mutations, as well as on thousands of years by atomic contamination uninhabitable areas. This is in addition to the fact that countless people will fall ill and die as a result of radioactive contamination, which in this way will also be used by the state and criminally to murder people who are becoming disagreeable to politics and secret services, etc. Especially by the USA, such crimes are caused and driven forward, as well as by other states and criminal organizations, as well as in a purely private way, as has been the case since time immemorial with regard to all kinds of crimes. And the crimes against all earthly humanity will be fueled by the United States of America, as they have been since their inception, leading to the partial extermination of the Indians and claiming hundreds of thousands of lives worldwide, as they did last year with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August and on Nagasaki on the 9th of August completely destroying these two cities. Not only have hundreds of thousands of human lives been murdered as a result of this tremendous crime by the USA, but many wounded and sick people have also been killed as a result of the nuclear fallout. In this alone, America is a disgrace to the nation USA and to all earthly mankind. Now, nuclear bomb tests are again being carried out by the USA already in the coming month of July on the Bikini Atoll, and these criminal tests will be followed in the next 8 decades by further nuclear tests by various other states. From my forecasts, which I have carried out until 2020, I know that from the first criminal nuclear test in the USA on the 16th of July last year until 2020, more than 2,000 further nuclear bomb tests will be ordered and carried out by 8 countries through their irresponsible, power-obsessed state leaders, their advisors, other powerful people, researchers, and scientists. Overall, these will also have an extremely detrimental and destructive effect on the entire planet, right down to its internal structures, which will lead to many sustainable and detrimental effects of Earth tectonics over many decades and well into the 3rd millennium, and thus to many serious earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. These nuclear tests also damage all structures of nature and the climate and alter them to such an extent that everything gets out of control and cannot be regenerated again. But things are going to get worse because the greed for power of the irresponsible statesmen, their advisors, supporters, followers, other power-hungry people, the military and scientists, and the all-promoting populations will no longer know any borders, which is why they will demand and develop even more deadly and often more destructive bombs and weapon systems, as well as missiles and all kinds of other weapons. Thus, especially through the mania of research and power of mankind, new need, misery, death, demise, destruction, and highest possible destruction are created bomb, rocket, and weapon systems of a technical and chemical nature. Delusional thoughts also play a role here because, as a result of stupid, fearful, cowardly, pathological ideas of enemy attack, possible imaginary aggressions and attacks are expected. This will lead to a senseless, morbidly stupid and irresponsible, unpredictable armament with nuclear weapons of all kinds for the hostile nuclear world powers, and thus to the danger of a nuclear war, which would destroy everything living on Earth and turn the planet into a dead desert. The majority of all present and future powers of the state, other powers of the state of all kinds, their advisors, supporters from the peoples and other powers, the military and scientists who play with fire in this regard, are so irresponsible, careless, thoughtless, unscrupulous, indifferent, frivolous, undutiful, ruthless, unscrupulous, and also so full of fear and cowardice that they are absolutely unpredictable and will be in the distant future. So they will order and advocate new nuclear tests and demand even more destructive bombs with tremendously more destructive potential than so-called implosion or uranium bombs still are. Consequently, the next crime arising out of atomic technology will not be absent, for it will be a much stronger hydrogen bomb, thousands of times superior to the uranium bomb that will be created next. But there will be more nuclear weapons, as well as many other forms that will be developed in the future, such as a fusion bomb and neutron bombs and other neutron weapons, etc. Everything will provoke the flight of many people, as was already the case last year during and after the World War, with numerous waves of flight, which will be followed by many more in the distant future. And the time of the atomic happening on the Bikini Atoll will be the actual time of the origin of the future worldwide flight waves, which for various reasons like drought, hunger, wars, misery and terror, etc., will extend very far into the third millennium and will finally cover 250 million to 350 million people. Non-war, politically, socially, and economically well-off states will be flooded with refugees in coming times, especially the whole of Europe and the North American continent. But I explained this to you several times during the last 2 years, as well as that in the future from all countries with undeniably and undoubtedly life-threatened refugees also work shy. Fraudsters, gangsters, murder, rabble, capital criminals, serious all sorts of other criminals and evildoers, criminals and terrorists will go along, who of course are not recognized by the authorities, border police, and security organs of the refugee countries admitted and recognized as needy refugees. And the number of these refugees of different imprints will steadily increase from year to year from now on. And from the third millennium, the entire world refugee problem will expand very rapidly, especially in the whole of Europe, which, apart from Switzerland, will be a union dictatorship at that time, in such a way that the refugee problem will then hardly be manageable anymore. As a result of hardship and misery in Africa, war and terrorism in Asia, the Middle East and the Orient, waves of refugees actually threatening the lives of refugees will also flood many terrorists, shy workers, elements seeking only prosperity, multifaceted criminals and criminals throughout Europe. And the real origin of these coming streams of refugees and migrations of peoples will be, on the one hand, the inexorably increasing overpopulation, by which unemployment, uprisings, poverty, hunger, diseases, wars, xenophobia, racial and religious hatred, terrorism, epidemics, lack of water, and many other factors will become insoluble problems. On the other hand, however, the USA's desire for world power will also contribute to this, through which serious criminal, political, secret service, military and economic interventions will take place in the various structures of the Asian and other Eastern, as well as Arab and Oriental states, and an enormous amount of disaster, suffering, misery as well as discord and terrorism will be created. As a result, in the future, many people will become enemies among themselves, as well as more and more to inability to live and indifference in every way, from which work, shyness, fraud, and thievery will arise, and many criminals will become burglars, murderers, and robbers. Others, on the other hand, will be attacked again, as from time immemorial, by boundless hatred against acquaintances, friends, one's own family members, and against neighbors, people of other faiths, strangers, foreigners, and other peoples. The racial madness built up in the Nazi Empire will continue in an expanding manner and will be carried far into the third millennium, whereby many innocent people will continue to be murdered worldwide by various racial madness movements. In the coming decades, and also well into the third millennium, many people will become degenerate, blind, fanatic believers and heirs of religions and sects, bloodthirsty, dehumanized, and murdering family honor fanatics, as well as murder delusional believers of globally active terrorist organizations. And from these, many murderers will emerge, especially from the 1990s and well into the third millennium, who, as individuals or in groups, carry out assassinations, murder actions, and suicide attacks, and in this way murder masses of innocent people, women, children, young people, and men of all ages. In this way, terrorism will spread around the world, causing many deaths to innocent and uninvolved people, which will briefly affect the thoughts and feelings of many earthly human beings, but will not really make them think, as has always been the case. Even the most horrible, murderous, and catastrophic events and occurrences touch, seize, and stimulate people in their thoughts and feelings, as they have always done for only a short time, after which everything is quickly forgotten again, without any actual profound upheaval and shaking in their senses taking place, which could lead to at least an attempt to do something to counter the evils. And this also refers to the fact that people live indifferently into the day and into time and do not think seriously about life, all events, everything that exists, and all the essentials of life. On the other hand, it also refers to the fact that in the coming times, well into the third millennium, the consequences will become worse and worse as a result of the rapid departure and passing away of thoughts and feelings concerning bad events and facts, such as catastrophic human degenerations, deadly and destructive events, and degenerating machinations as a result of overpopulation. And the inexorably increasing overpopulation will lead to malignant, dramatic, and mutating changes, as well as death and destructive factors on the planet, the seas, and all continental waters, as well as on the land and all life forms. The health capacity and behavior of people will also degenerate into disease and harm, leading to many and varied deaths, and the climate will be adversely affected by the effects of irresponsible practices arising from overpopulation and catastrophically altered. And for all the fauna and flora for the planet itself, and for all the things of life and the existence of all things. The result is that ultimately the destructive effects in every respect are no longer controlled, can no longer be reversed, can no longer be stopped, and thus the entire earthly existence is called into question. And when mankind of Earth is not brought to stop the growth of the degenerating overpopulation to avoid further disaster in this way, and to reduce the already existing one, then the last disaster of the downfall will not be avoidable. If, however, catastrophic events occur, such as murders and mass murders committed by individuals or groups of people who are terrorists, or by depressed, jealous, hate-ridden, criminal, mentally or consciously ill people, then many rulers and other responsible persons in all states will also be affected. But the majority of them, as since time immemorial, will only express dishonest, unrelated and hypocritical condolences and other great words when murderous acts are committed by individuals or entire groups. It will not matter whether the acts are committed by perpetrators who are depressed or otherwise suffering from psyche or consciousness disorders, the confused, hate, stressed, racists or terrorists, because, as a rule, as always, The condolences and sympathies of rulers and other responsible persons will only be lies, deception, and appearances alien to sincerity as well as honest compassion. So the appearance and presence of the rulers, state powers, and responsible persons at terrible events will be just as useful for themselves and for the preservation of their office as their words and promises. Wit for those suffering will only be deception, trickery, lies, deception, and empty words, as it has always been held so. And just as the majority of the authorities and all the other responsible persons will make only empty promises and make stupid speeches in the various appearing murders by individual perpetrators or by groups of a terrorist nature, this will also be the case in many other relationships. So it will happen in the same way in the coming decades and well into the third millennium, when the natural disasters that are already looming today will occur, the origin of which will be traced back to the overpopulation's machinations that destroy nature, planet, and climate. Everything will be irreparable and will also claim countless human lives, cause immense destruction, and ultimately lead to poverty, misery, diseases, epidemics, lack of space, lack of food and water spreading over the entire earth and mankind in such a way that nothing can be set against everything anymore. And when this time comes, when earthly mankind does not return in foreseeable and useful time to the way of the healthy intellect and reason, then there will be no more help. And this also means that if the growth of the overpopulation is not stopped and not rigorously reduced by a birth regulation and brought to a normal and planetary state in the foreseeable future, not finally a worldwide state of peace, comprehensive freedom, and a comprehensive security for the planet and its nature, as well as for all life, is created, then an end of the advanced civilizations of earthly mankind will be inevitable. It will still take some time until then, but it will be inevitable if overpopulation and everything else that endangers the entire earthly life of the planet and all living beings is not stopped. Unfortunately, this will not be the case in the coming decades and well into the third millennium, even if you write your letters and send them to all governments, media, and important organizations. But as you do your work, people will gradually come together, group together, and learn your teachings worldwide. Try to obey, learn to live and spread, from which the hope will arise that in 800 to 900 years, a great many people will slowly try to consciously use their intellect and their reason and turn to the teachings which you will, from now on, write down, spread and teach to man on a large scale. But you must know that this will be an exceptionally heavy and very difficult task and work to be done in a world which is very hostile to your mission, because in it people are misled, unfree, shackled, enslaved, and ensnared by religions and sects, as well as by know-it-allism, habits, self-importance, vices and addictions, vanity, megalomania, and delusions in some ways, and so on. And it will be the same in the future as it has been up to now in this respect, and it will continue to grow steadily, for as a result of the unstoppable increase in overpopulation for a long time to come, it will become apparent that in the coming decades up to the third millennium, the world will be faced with a great deal of change. In the course of the 20th millennium, as well as far into this, more and more people became addicted to alcohol, drug and jealousy, greed for money, violence, sexual abuse of children and women, and rape, as well as prostitution, which will be permitted and taxed by the state in the future, whereby all these degenerations become great problems. In the future, more and more people will appear who are confused about their consciousness, as well as people who are suffering from the psyche, who will suffer from severe depression and many other diseases of a damaged consciousness and a damaged psyche. The origins for this will be based in the many effects and things of the exuberant overpopulation, such as in a fanatically degenerating political, religious, sectarian delusion, in religious and sectarian superstition delusions, in delusions caused by alcohol and drugs, in fantasies and illusions, unrealities, delusions, deceptions, delusions, visions of delusion, wishful visions, deceptions, and suggested erroneous and confused inspirations of unscrupulous seducers. The rapidly increasing overpopulation will also have a very lasting and detrimental effect on morals and on the behavior, diseases, and sufferings of people, such as anancastic neurosis, drives, pathological passions, mania, unbridled desire and addiction, including rage, raving madness, madness and recklessness, anger, obsessive-compulsive disorder, etc. And the overpopulation will also lead to a general softening of thoughts, feelings, and the psyche, the body, and a life instability that even small tensions and efforts will lead to hot flushes, fever, delusions, and collapse. However, this will also result in strange imaginations, insane phenomena, fantasies, unrealities, and dizziness. In the coming decades and well into the third millennium, countless people will fall into pathological thoughts, failings, and thus confusions of consciousness and severe psychological disorders, which will result in the future from a reduction in the control over life and quality of life, namely through a softening of life. Also, a lack of interest in life, lack of courage in life, and weary of life will spread far and wide and lead to many suicides. Also, an extensive indifference concerning either the own consciousness development, the personal values of the well-being, the education, self-knowledge, and the self-worth will belong, particularly with many younger humans, to the agenda, and what will be related to one's own person in terms of indifference will also be transferred to others and will increasingly prevent connecting relationships between people and ultimately dissolve them. This not only results in unrelated conditions in society, but also in families, acquaintances, friendships, and partnerships, whereby people become strangers, meaningless and indifferent to each other, and consequently all go their own ways. In the future, however, it will also be the case that many people will succumb to a lack of control and atrophy of understanding and reason as a result of a degenerating destructive change in the ability of consciousness to comprehend, understand, and process. And this will already begin to take shape in the course of the next decades, which will have a negative effect on young and younger people in particular with regard to their negative lifestyle and degeneration. The further and in the future, more and more spreading wrong education of the parents concerning their descendants softens and degenerates their intellect and reasonability, which is deposited in the genes and inherited by the descendants again on their descendants. As the overpopulation grows, the intellect and the reason of the descendants degenerate and mutate, resulting in a chaotic mind-reason control, which is also expressed in a life-threatening way in all relationships. A wrong education does not only promote the general softness of the ability of the descendants to understand and reason, but also a low development of intelligence and physical impairments of various kinds. And the fact is that these detrimental changes are unstoppably inherited by the rapidly increasing overpopulation and make the majority of humanity a trophy more and more in terms of understanding and reason, only very slowly but unstoppably. And this further leads to the fact, as has been the case since time immemorial, that only people can assert themselves and rise to governmental power and to similar and parallel offices and positions which are largely powerful in controlling their intellect and reason, and the majority of these power men, with the exception of those who are strong in character, honorable, of integrity and trustworthy, can use and exploit suggestively and rhetorically the majority of the people who are less gifted in understanding and reason, draw them to their side and bring themselves to government power. Or they are people with weak reason and intellect who manage to do it through relationships, falsehood, violence, lies and deception, hypocrisy, ruthlessness and persuasion in governments, offices, and high positions of responsibility. But what the future will bring is the fact that, in general, many people fall into nefarious offences, becoming licentious, immoral, unseemly, unbecoming, corrupt, amoral, disreputable, wretched, bad, indecent, vulgar, and discarded, etc. Reality and truth are no longer perceived as real, and consequently more and more mental confusion arises, and people create false role models, ideals, models, utopias, as well as delusions and desires, thereby becoming uninitiated and without their own opinion, thereby fanatically and morbidly jealous of things, actions, and deeds of other people. In this way, unrealities arise, which degenerate into life meaninglessness and no longer permit valuable and advanced thoughts, feelings, and one's own achievements and opinions, whereby only the achievements, actions, opinions, and deeds of other people are recognized, reproduced, and accentuated. Even esoteric groupings and organizations, religions, sects and philosophies, etc., which are alien to reality, will increasingly dominate the faithful and, as since time immemorial, keep them away from reality and truth and lead them astray. Faith-based forms of delusion promoted by religion and sectarian aberrations will increase worldwide in the future, and the people who believe in them in this way will be deceived by sensory illusions, religious lies, pretenses, delusions, juggleries, and unrealities, superstition and belief in ghosts and ghosts, sect-induced clairvoyance, God's message, and religious miraculous activity will lead to new highlights in the future, as will fear of ghosts, mysticism, belief in miracles, and delusions. All this will be irresponsibly controlled by the lies and deception of religions and sects and their fanatical and power-obsessed advocates who gather many believers around them and seduce them to torture, violence, war, murder, rape, and destruction in the name of an alleged creator God, in order to torture and kill innocent people as God's warriors, and thereby reach their alleged God in paradise. In this way, it will be that in the coming decades, such occurrences will be prepared and later practiced, and will bring murder, death, and destruction to the whole world and its humanity well into the third millennium. So, in the course of time, many misled people will appear who will bring murderous misfortune, suffering, misery and mourning to the people of the whole world as sex-controlled and terrorist, radicalized, and delusional people. And they will do this as individuals or in groups, as fanatical holy warriors and avengers, murdering countless innocent people, causing great destruction and irretrievably destroying even very old cultural assets. But in the future there will also be more and more mothers who murder their newborns, as well as their older children, but also mothers and fathers who increasingly abuse their daughters and sons, while other women, as well as men, increasingly commit more and more criminal, as well as capital and serious criminal acts, which often end in death. And if such deeds happen, then as a result of a precarious humanistic effeminacy, ever worse, more reprehensible actions directed against the body, life, and property of men are committed, and deeds carried out for which the perpetrators, however, in wrongly understood humanity, are far too mildly called to account and thereby animated to continue in their actions and actions. Also, in the coming decades, an official, legal murder permitted by authorities and law will come up for people willing to die, which will be called suicide and will cause a so-called death tourism. In this way, those who have no responsibility for their lives and who are willing to die will be murdered. They will also be allowed to travel from foreign countries to countries in which the legalized, dishonorable, and undignified systematic murder of people with lethal narcotics by irresponsible murder lust will be permitted, as was also practiced by National Socialists in the Nazi Empire and will soon also be the case in Switzerland. All that has been stated, explained, and said so far corresponds to predictions of coming events, as I have seen them in the future, and have now brought them closer to you. Everything spoken by myself, as well as everything you say yourself, is extensively recorded and stored by a very sophisticated phonographic apparatus, whereby it never gets lost, so even after a very long time, everything will be retrievable again. However, it will be necessary for you and your task and mission that I have to explain many more predictive facts to you, which you must not pass on, and therefore not be openly mentioned. Consequently, you must not write them down for memory, but only those facts, explanations, and predictions which I may tell you for the work of your writings to be written by you, which you shall write from the 1950s onwards and send to all governments of the world and to well-known public media, such as journal, radio, and newspaper editorships, but also to various well-known organizations. Only in the distant future will you be allowed to speak openly about the contents of our conversations if you demand what you will actually do, as I have seen, by looking at you in future times. That should be enough explained and said for today.
It is also good enough, and to be honest, my head is smoking, and I am glad that you do not want to explain and say any more now. Still, I have a question, if you do not mind.
You can always ask what you want, because on the one hand, it is important that you ask questions when you are interested in something, and on the other hand, it is my duty to always answer all your questions.
Thanks, you have said that before? It is that you said a word I've never heard before and did not understand the meaning of.
What was that?
You said a phonography device or something. What's that? What's that?
This is an electrotechnical apparatus which is not yet under development on Earth, but which has already forerunners in earthly electro-development and corresponds to a branch of information technology and electronics, and deals with the acquisition, representation, transmission, and processing of digital quantities, and represents digital quantities in figures.
I do not understand, so I cannot do anything with your explanation.
The phonography apparatus is an apparatus that records sounds in true-to-sound writing and can reproduce noises, sounds, music, sounds, and, of course, speech. If you are interested, I will teach you about this at a later date.
What do you mean? What I'm interested in now? This thing, this apparatus, which records everything that is spoken and can then be listened to again?
Yes, everything is recorded, every sound and every noise, which can then be listened to again. The phonography apparatus can do much more, however, because it converts every spoken word into characters, and consequently all words spoken are also recorded in writing as a document.
Now I understand. Thanks for the explanation.
Then I'll take you back now, but not to Langenzingen today, because I think that when it gets dark, the way home from there is too far for you, which is why I'll drop you off behind the big barn in Erachfeld off the Feldstrasse. From there you will be home in a few minutes, and I also think that our future meeting place should also be there, because it is a safe place, and people rarely pass by there. Not until the next Saturday afternoon will I come back, take you away, and continue teaching.
That was a long conversation back then, and it was good that Svath did not explain any more, because my head was really smoking, which is why I was glad when he did not drop me off again at Langenzingen, and I could walk home the short distance of about 5 minutes. My head was still smoking for days, because all the many things that your father explained to me and brought home to me made me very tired, which is why I needed a lot of time until the next conversation on the following Saturday to deal with everything and digest everything.
It was really a lot, but I know you took it all well.
The time is now quite advanced, but do I still have questions if it is possible for you to respond to them?
It's no problem for me because I am not in a hurry.
Then I would like to ask you something that once again refers to Switzerland and the EU dictatorship, if you know what it is about. There was talk of a so-called framework agreement, which is to be discussed. Since you are concerned with what happens all the time between Switzerland and the EU dictatorship, you know for sure, do not you?
That's the case, yes. This impure matter is a damaging attack on the protection of the liberal democratic constitutional order for Switzerland and its people, in such a way that the protection of the Constitution and the legal bases are to be circumvented and undermined creepingly in a deceitful manner if this framework agreement should be able to be extended as planned. The fundamentally culpable for this request concerns of Switzerland, who is short-sighted, ill-considered, and unaware of the actual facts regarding the plans of the EU dictatorship in relation to his idea, and is thus also unaware of the reality and willing. In his inadequacy, on the one hand, unconsciously to harass the federal constitution, and on the other hand, to put Switzerland's freedom and neutrality at risk with such a treaty. Subsequently, the envisaged treaty, if concluded, would gradually undermine Switzerland's national jurisdiction and replace it with EU dictatorship courts. In his lack of neediness, the actual originator of his idea regarding the agreement is just as unaware of the resulting consequences as are all his like-minded people, who unfortunately are very numerous among the Swiss population and tend to join the EU dictatorship and are willing to kneel before the EU dictatorship, just as the German people did before the Nazis and led to the last World War. Should the agreement come about, then Switzerland would ultimately be nothing more than an EU dictatorship vassal state in a creeping manner over the coming periods, which would only be allowed to act and exist in accordance with EU dictatorship requirements, while Switzerland's legislation would over time fall under the thumb of EU dictatorship laws.
And of course, all the morbidly stupid EU dictatorship advocates of Switzerland do not see this. And that as the author, there is an unconscious betrayal of his homeland behind. As with all other like-minded people, this is not recognized because in all of them the necessary intelligence and reason are lacking.
Unfortunately, this is the case, because only people who lack clear thinking and judgment, and thus genius, intellect and astuteness, as well as understanding, reason and, moreover, the responsibility for national peace, far-reaching democracy, neutrality, freedom, and security as these values exist in Switzerland can throw their homeland away to a dictatorship in betrayal and fit into its suppression of all rights.
Then a question. Your father Svath once explained something to me about the human brain in connection with the brains of animals, and all other life forms on land, air, and water. As I remember, he explained that completely all life forms have a fore, middle, and lozenge brain. This is one thing. The other is that of all forms of life, man is the slowest of all beings capable of learning in terms of learning, which, however, is not disadvantageous, but advantageous. The human slowness of learning has many advantages over all other life forms which have a faster learning ability, because speed learning is based on the fact that only individual things can be learned quickly, as it can be only an innate behavior, or can be traced back to observation, dressage, imitation, training, or genetic inheritance, etc., but not to effective learning. He called it, if I remember correctly, behavioral biology or something. This results in the fact that at least the non-human forms of life on Earth are not capable of conscious, logical trains of thought, but as a rule only halfway conscious memory processes. With regard to the highly developed ability to learn, as Svath said, especially apes are most likely to approach the mind and the highly developed ability to learn of man. Svath taught me that the slow learning of man has the unsurpassable advantage over the extremely fast, but not consciously learning non-human forms of life, that man on the one hand can consciously absorb, store, and on the other hand consciously recall a lot of knowledge in many directions. Further, he taught me that contrary to all non-human forms of life, which are quick learners, man is capable of slow learning of conscious, tremendously broad thought processes, like for example with regard to ideas, logical thought processes, thought constructions, hypotheses, theories and considerations. He can also consciously make inventions and manufacture products, operate and use devices and apparatus of all kinds, perform conscious actions, perform conscious deeds, and consciously train himself further and develop further consciously.
What you are addressing is a very wide-ranging topic, which at least today I'm not able to answer in detail, because the time is already far advanced, so I will keep it short. In animals and gems, etc., many behaviors are determined by genetic information. However, the more highly developed the life form is, the more capable it is that the living being can learn much more, which, however, refers in the first place, of course, to the human being, who is in the first place in this respect. A further central element of the theory of situated learning is that the development of cognitive structures is not in the foreground. There is a correlation between internal or mental and external or situational processes, whereby not only purely material aspects of available tools, etc., are meant, but also the social environment of the learning person in particular. The conscious and rational lifelong learning of the human being is a concept which enables him in normal behavior and consciousness to learn consciously throughout his entire life. to acquire skills, abilities, and knowledge with the information and self-competence of the individual playing a decisive role. Learning means a present context or an accompanying phenomenon. When a person learns, this corresponds to situational learning, or situational cognition, which describes a social anchoring of individual learning that is only possible for the person. Through the capacity of judgment, clear consciousness, insight, experience, cognition, determination, thoughts, and judgment, which are decisive factors. The whole thing has a relation to the living world, which must be created by man in a correct, positive, and responsible way, and everything related to it must serve to ensure that man appropriates and learns everything that is necessary in a situational way, and that everything that follows is of significance and relevance both now and in the future. Overall, the whole of the core idea of situated learning is based on a social anchoring, because everything is founded in learning values that are based on active, conscious, evolutive, constructive, emotional, self-directed, and socially binding learning. In this relation, situational learning means that through interaction with other people, learning, knowledge, cognitively acquired skills, etc., take place in authentic situations. And this is because the act of learning can never be separated from a thought, an idea, a thing, a situation, or an idea, etc. So it is not possible that abilities, ideas, conceptions, and knowledge, etc., can simply be explained or taught into the human being's learning. And this is because man is effectively related to having to work through everything and everyone through a longer learning process. So it must also be clear that he must be oriented towards life, learning, the world, application, action, and in this respect also responsible, and that he must therefore always be consciously active in all his learning. The absolute self-control in relation to one's own learning process is of great importance here, whereby the learning time is also important, depending on the needs of the learner. Attention must also be paid to the environment, because this can also have a decisive influence on learning. It is also necessary to take into account the material aspects and the situation that arise in learning, as well as the social environment, because these are also crucial in relation to learning activity, because there is interaction or interrelation with everything. However, it has to be said that in situ learning, it is not the skills and knowledge that are at the center, but rather the actual learning and thus the actual learning process. So this related to man, and now there is still a lot to say about the animals and mammals, as well as the animals and other forms of life. Various animals, by which mainly mammals tamed by humans are meant, but not animals. Water and other living beings can learn to listen to commands, to react accordingly, and also to carry out desired movements and actions, as they can also learn polymorphic movement, sound and behavior forms, etc., without human intervention. Especially in dog keeping, this is proven in different forms in a useful way, but also in circus demonstrations, the learning ability of mammals is demonstrated. Less such abilities are the case with gems, water, and plumage living beings. However, such behaviors can occur also with these in the lesser measure. It is true that apes, as you say, are the closest to the mind and learning ability of man. As in humans, the factors innate behavior and acquired behavior are also given in these animals and in mammals in general, whereby learning qualities and learning techniques must also be taken into account. It is also very important to distinguish between positive and negative experiences, because humans are very conscious and mammals are instinctively and unconsciously trying to do everything positive again and to repeat it. Everything positive is a good and useful experience for man and mammal, as well as for all animals and other living beings, which are classified according to the ability of the experience in relation to the positive, while negative experiences for man and mammal, and quite altogether for all life forms, which have a fore, middle, and lozenge brain, have extremely lasting, disparaging, disadvantageous, harmful, bad, and disadvantageous or even destructive effects. Basically, it must still be said that the imprinting of learning is a special form in which innate and acquired knowledge interact. I do not want to say more about it today, perhaps another time, if it should be necessary, because my time.
Of course I do. Thank you, my friend, but if I can ask you one more question? I recently had a phone call from a friend who wants to call me again in the course of the next month. Because I want to get your answer for his question, which is certainly of interest to many people, but especially to me.
If it is necessary, please ask your question.
Thanks. What else interests me? The USA, but also the EU dictatorship, and above all Angela Merkel, who steers the EU dictators, continue to work provocatively against Russia, especially with lies, unjustified sanctions, slander, and military marches and missile deployments, etc. in East EU dictatorship countries, as well as with lousy interference with regard to Ukraine. Can you tell me where this is going to lead?
What the EU dictatorship and its secret leader, Merkel, as well as the USA, take for granted and are subordinate to in the relations you mentioned, leads to a new endangerment of the very peculiar and shaky world peace. If one can speak of such a peace at all, because in dozens of states, dictatorships and terrorist organizations, as well as criminal organizations, are up to their ropes. When I speak of a world peace, then such a peace refers only to the understanding of the prevailing dubious state of peace, as it only resulted after the 3 world wars in the years 1756, 1763, 1914, 1918, and 1939, 1945 as a so-called peace of victory through the end of the World War. But what results from the intrigues against Russia, how they are carried out by the USA and the EU dictatorship, with the German Chancellor Merkel at the forefront, who decisively and unpleasantly steers the EU dictatorship and its dictators in particular, without them becoming aware of how they are under the influence of this woman, is extremely unpleasant. And the unpleasant thing is that, as a result of the criminal machinations of the Western world against Russia, whereby the evils emanate, especially from the entire EU dictatorship and from the USA, Putin has for some time distanced himself from the West and has already begun to build up a far-reaching and in the future probably coming military powerful alliance with China as well as with Arab, Oriental, and Asian as well as other states. This alliance is becoming ever larger and more powerful and is slowly posing a threat to the West, particularly to and provoked by the entire EU dictatorship and the US. So an alliance dangerous to the West is being formed by states that are not exactly friendly to the EU dictatorship and the USA. These are the currently unpleasant existing facts.
This is really very unpleasant, because in the end it could actually lead to acts of war, with which I do not actually think from Russia, but from anti-American states which are sufficient, which would only too gladly see the USA, addicted to world domination, interfering everywhere and inciting war, lying on the ground.
You're saying what's real.
Then I have no more questions.
Then I will go now and say goodbye to you, Edouard, dear friend. But I still have to say that due to a special, longer, and more important job I have to do, I will probably not be able to come here for a month or longer. If there's anything, contact Florina or Anjana. Florina will get back to you anyway, because she will give you something for Guido's book, which I will hand over to her when I have the time to make it out. Until then, dear friend, farewell.
Thank you also, and goodbye, dear friend.